Rachel Quinn zipped her backpack for a solo hike through the most remote canyons of the Sierra Nevadas and vanished without a sound. Her father combed the backcountry every weekend, refusing to accept what the headlines suggested, that she was gone for good. Search teams found nothing. Not a boot print, not a thread of clothing. Just trees, silence, and the feeling that something had watched them then disappeared. But 11 months later, a wildlife biologist tracking hawks on a craggy ridgeline made a discovery that would unravel everything investigators thought they knew and expose a nightmare quietly buried beneath California's most majestic mountains. The Sierra Nevadas don't ease you in. They rise in brutal slabs of granite, abrupt, imposing, and unmoved by time. There are no soft hills to welcome you, no gentle paths, just towering cliffs, wind-sculpted rock, and a silence so absolute it feels ancient. For generations, these mountains have drawn wanderers, seekers, and artists alike, people hoping to test themselves or find clarity among the peaks. In the summer of 2023, a young woman named Rachel Quinn came for all three reasons. Rachel, or Rach, as her friends called her, was 24, but she walked with the kind of steady presence you don't learn in cities. She had moved to Mammoth Lakes the year before, leaving behind a graphic design job in Sacramento that never quite fit. Instead, she found a part-time gig at an outfitter shop, a one-bedroom cabin with creaky floorboards, and the wild that had called to her since she was a child. Her cabin walls were covered with USGS topo maps of the John Muir Wilderness, lines of pencil and ink tracing her past hikes and future dreams. Her own photos decorated the rest, a coyote silhouetted at dawn, the orange blaze of sunlight hitting Mount Ritter, wildflowers clinging to cliffs where no one else dared tread. Those close to her would later describe her with one word: precise. She wasn't reckless, not a thrill chaser. She was a documentarian of silence, someone who saw the mountains not as a challenge, but as a cathedral. She respected them, revered them, understood the cost of underestimating them. Rachel was an experienced solo backpacker, someone who found peace in solitude, clarity in the sound of her boots on loose gravel, and joy in the quiet click of her camera shutter. That camera, a worn Nikon D750, was her most treasured tool. It helped her translate what the wilderness made her feel into something permanent. She'd spent months planning her most challenging trek yet, a 4-day loop deep into the Evolution Basin, rugged, steep, stunning, and unforgiving. Nearly 22 miles of exposed ridgelines, glacial lakes, and thin-air passes. To Rachel, it wasn't just a trip. It was a kind of ritual, a way to honor everything she'd learned and maybe, finally, create a photo series worthy of her first solo exhibition. Her roommate, Jamie, would later remember her sitting cross-legged on the floor, poring over maps by headlamp. She was chasing the perfect alpine sunrise, Jamie said. She believed if she could get high enough by dawn, she'd photograph something no one else had ever captured. In the days leading up to her departure, Rachel moved through her usual careful rhythm. Her mother, Denise, recalled their final FaceTime Rachel kneeling on the cabin floor, gear laid out in rows. Her osprey pack with its faded straps, her ultralight tent, her goose-down sleeping bag, a tiny stove, fuel canisters, a meticulously labeled food stash. She held up her Garmin InReach satellite device and smiled. "I'll check in every night, Mom. Promise." She was always so responsible, Denise told reporters later. That's what breaks me. She wasn't careless. She wasn't the kind of girl to get lost. She had her first aid kit, her water filtration gear, a spare battery pack for her camera, bear spray, even a compact wilderness guidebook she kept in a plastic sleeve. Her preparedness made her disappearance even more haunting. It didn't make sense. On the morning of Thursday, the 17th of August, 2023, Rachel parked her silver Outback at the North Lake trailhead just before 8 a.m. The sky was cloudless, the air crisp, buzzing with that particular stillness the High Sierra sometimes holds at sunrise, the kind that makes you feel like the entire world is listening. Before stepping onto the trail, she approached a pair of retirees photographing the lake. With a smile, she asked if they might take her picture. The man Alan, a retired math teacher from Oregon, was happy to oblige. He captured what would become the last known image of Rachel Quinn. She's standing in front of the still water, pack secured tightly, hiking pole in one hand. Her tank top is bright coral, her hair tied back, her smile effortless. Behind her, Mount Humphreys rises like a stone sentinel, sharp and quiet. She thanked us. Alan later told her ranger, "She just radiated something. Like peace. Like joy." She told them she was doing the Darwin Bench route and expected to be back by Sunday. Then she turned, stepped onto the trail, and disappeared. She said she was heading up into Darwin Canyon, recalled Marissa Hale, a woman Rachel had chatted with briefly near the trailhead. She said she felt like the luckiest person alive to have all of this in her backyard. After they parted ways, Rachel found a quiet spot by the lake. The still water mirrored the early morning sky, cloudless and blue, while a cool wind moved through the alpine trees like breath. She took a photo of herself with the ridgeline behind her, then sent it to her mother in Salt Lake City. The text read, "Off I go. The mountains are calling. Weather's perfect. Talk to you Sunday night." It would be the last message anyone would ever receive from her. She adjusted her shoulder straps, stepped onto the narrow trail leading into the canyon, and vanished into the shadowy columns of red fir and lodgepole pine, a lone figure swallowed by the vastness of the Sierra backcountry. Sunday came. The sun dropped behind the jagged skyline of the Sierra crest, casting long strokes of gold and violet across the clouds. In her quiet home in Salt Lake City, Denise Quinn checked her phone. No messages. No missed calls. By 9 p.m., she was pacing. Not panicked, not yet, but uneasy. Rachel was responsible. Careful. She'd said she would check in. Maybe the satellite messenger had lost signal. Maybe she met another hiker and decided to linger one more night by an alpine lake. There were reasonable explanations. But by Monday evening, those explanations began to fall apart, and dread crept in. Each unanswered call went to voicemail. Each text remained unread, a cold gray checkmark suspended in digital silence. Denise knew her daughter. Rachel wasn't the type to ignore contact. She wasn't careless. Something was wrong. With trembling fingers, Denise dialed the Inyo County Sheriff's Department at 7:14 p.m., trying her best to keep her voice level. At first she sounded calm, but it broke as she gave them Rachel's name, her planned route, and her expected return time. Within the hour, the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Rangers had been alerted. A ranger was dispatched to the North Lake trailhead to check for her vehicle. That night, under a rising August moon, Rachel Quinn was officially declared missing. Her name became more than just a name. It became a case file, a grid line on a search map, a question whispered into 800 square miles of wild silence. The response wasn't rushed. It was clinical, coordinated, procedural. By sunrise Tuesday, Ranger Tom Albrecht, a man as rugged as the mountains he patrolled, stood beside Rachel's silver Subaru Outback. The lot was empty except for a few early hikers and the thick hush of dawn. A light coat of tan dust and pine pollen had settled on the windshield, a quiet marker of time. He peered inside. A half-empty coffee thermos sat in the cup holder. A folded map of the Evolution Basin lay on the passenger seat. It all looked normal. Tout normal. Inside the metal trail register, her name was there in clean handwriting. Rachel Quinn. Route. Lama Col. Darwin Bench Loop. Duration. 3 nights. Expected out. Sunday. There was no corresponding sign-out. In 20 years on the job, Albrecht had seen this before, and usually it ended well. A lost hiker. A dead battery. A spontaneous detour. But as he radioed his findings back to the incident commander, a cold knot settled in his gut. This didn't feel like that. By 8 a.m., a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. A command center was set up near Lake Sabrina, where the gravel lot buzzed with energy, the clatter of carabiners, the bark of dogs being prepped, the low drone of helicopters overhead. Lead Ranger Michael Connolly, calm, methodical, unreadable, stood before a massive laminated topographic map. A red grease pencil line traced Rachel's expected route across the ridges and high passes of the John Muir Wilderness. "All right, listen up," he said, voice cutting through the static. "Our subject is Rachel Quinn, 24, solo hiker, experienced, equipped. Last known location, North Lake Trailhead, Thursday morning. Her planned first night was Darwin Bench. Teams were dispatched. 2 K-9 units were lifted by helicopter to high ground. Ground crews moved in from Lamarck Lakes and Paiute Pass. The search grid expanded by the hour. The first break and the first strange mystery came just after noon. A ground crew moving up the switchbacks toward Alpine Basin spotted something. A small green dome tent tucked under a stand of fir trees near a glacial tarn. It was Rachel's, end quote. The campsite was pristine. The tent was perfectly staked. Inside, her sleeping pad was unrolled. A small day pack sat beside it holding only a water bottle, a used protein bar wrapper, and a tube of sunscreen. But something was missing. Her main pack, a blue Osprey, packed with food, camera gear, and her sleeping bag, was gone. She hadn't set up camp just to vanish. She had eaten, unrolled her gear, settled in. But something had pulled her away. No signs of struggle, no animal prints, no drag marks. Just absence. Just silence. Rachel's backpack was gone. So were her hiking boots. The scene was baffling. It suggested she had set up camp or shelter for the night, then, for reasons unknown, laced up her boots, shouldered her heavy multi-day pack, and walked off, leaving behind her lighter day pack. It didn't make sense. In the backcountry, logic is often simple and hard-earned. A hiker might leave their main pack behind to explore nearby terrain with only a light day bag. But to do the opposite, to abandon the day pack and take the heavy one, was contradictory, illogical. It sent a quiet chill down the backs of the search team. This discovery triggered the immediate deployment of K-9 units to the area. Kaiser, a seasoned German shepherd with years of field experience, was led to the tent flap. He sniffed the ground for a long moment, then let out a low whine and took off, his handler close behind. The dog had caught a scent, but it didn't lead back toward the trail or toward the lake or any known route. Instead, it cut sharply uphill, across loose scree, thick willow thickets, and the kind of terrain no experienced hiker would willingly take with a full pack. Still, the team followed. The slope grew steeper. Fallen trees created an almost impassable mess of limbs and bark. Sharp granite tore at boots. Sweat soaked their shirts. Half a mile later, they reached a cluster of massive boulders, tangled with deadfall impassable by any normal measure. And there, Kaiser stopped. He circled, sniffed, whined again, then sat. The trail was gone. Not faded, not confused. Gone. As if Rachel Quinn had been lifted into the air and vanished. Her scent evaporated into nothing. The handler radioed it in, frustration in his voice. "The trail terminates here. There's nowhere else to go." While the K-9 team hit their wall, other rangers turned their attention to the only people who had seen Rachel that day, the couple from Oregon who had taken her final photo. They were found that afternoon at a hotel in Bishop, packing for their flight home. Eleanor and Gerald Hale were devastated to hear the news. They told the rangers what they could that Rachel had seemed upbeat, focused, and deeply happy. Then Eleanor remembered something else. "About 10 minutes after we said goodbye to her," she said, frowning, "we passed a man, another hiker, alone, looked intense." Gerald nodded. He had one of those old military-style packs, faded, worn. Didn't say anything, didn't even look at us. Just stared straight ahead, Eleanor added. Hard face, tired eyes, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. The description was vague, frustratingly so. But with no other leads, it became the center of the investigation. A forensic sketch artist was brought in. Using the couple's recollections, a composite was created. A man, late 30s to early 40s, gaunt features, Sunday scarred skin, deep-set eyes, a hard, unreadable expression. The man, whoever he was, became a ghost. Maybe he was just another hiker, passing through the same wilderness. Or maybe he had followed Rachel. No one knew. and no one ever saw him again. Overhead, helicopters flew slow, methodical grid patterns, their searchlines crawling across a sea of ridgelines, gullies, and cliffs. From above, the Sierra looked breathtaking and impossible. The forest canopy was a green blur, broken only by talus fields and glacial runoff. The canyons were deep scars in the earth, steep-walled and shadowed. It was a perfect hiding place, or a grave. The spotters aboard the choppers scanned relentlessly, eyes searching for a flash of color, a piece of clothing, the glint of gear. But the Sierra held its silence. It had given Rachel beauty, and now it refused to give her back. On day 5, everything changed. The skies that had been bright blue since the search began darkened without warning. Clouds thickened, turning charcoal gray and ominous. Then came the sound, a distant rumble across the western sky. Thunder. Rain followed, and with it, the mountain's fury. Bolts of lightning cracked across the peaks, their white fire illuminating the ridgelines. Rain fell in sheets. Trails turned to rivers. Loose earth became mud. Rock turned slick. For safety, the search was suspended. 36 hours passed before crews could re-enter the field. By then, they all knew what the storm meant. Any remaining scent trails? Gone. Any prints? Washed away. Any chance of finding gear? Buried beneath runoff or swept into ravines. It was as if the mountains themselves had decided to erase Rachel Quinn one storm at a time. By day 10, the outcome was grim. Despite hundreds of volunteer hours, air support, dogs, and trained teams, the search had produced nothing beyond the abandoned tent and that one haunting vanished scent trail. Resources were strained, budgets stretched. At the nightly briefing, under a canvas tent dimly lit by portable lamps, Ranger Mike Connolly delivered the decision everyone feared. The active search would be suspended. They would move into limited continuous patrol, a phrase that felt as clinical as it was final. Rachel was, in official terms, no longer expected to be found alive. The map boards were folded away. The volunteers hugged. Some cried. The command post came down, one tent stake at a time. Rachel's parents, Denise and Andrew Quinn, had been holding vigil from a small rented cabin in Mammoth. They were shattered. Andrew, a surveyor by trade, stood in the now empty planning room, staring at the red line on the topo map, the one that marked Rachel's intended route. It ended in blank space, in silence. The official effort might be over, but for him it had only just begun. The indifferent beauty of the Sierra Nevada was as merciless as it was breathtaking. The vibrant greens of summer bled into the fiery golds and oranges of October, painting the aspen groves with impossible color. But the warmth did not last. The fires of fall were quickly extinguished by the first early snows of mid-October, which arrived without ceremony. The towering peaks vanished behind curtains of gray, the sky turned cold and metallic, and a silence deep and ancient fell across the range. It was the silence of winter, and with it the active memory of Rachel Quinn began to recede. She faded from daily conversation, transforming from a person into a name, from a name into a story, from a story into a cautionary tale told in whispers to new trail staff and first-time hikers. The missing posters that once clung brightly to signboards across Inyo and Mono counties began to curl at the corners. The ink, once urgent and black, turned bluish and faint under weeks of high-elevation sun. Her file, now tucked away in a thick binder at the ranger station in Mammoth Lakes, was weighed down with procedural forms, K9 scent logs, and air search maps. But the file felt cold, inactive. Like the wilderness it tried to explain had swallowed its subject whole and digested her into the topography. Rachel's name joined a quiet list, those who had disappeared in the Sierra and never returned. Her face became one among the vanished, the ones whose boots never walked back out. For most, the story was over. But for one man, it never truly ended. Andrew Quinn, Rachel's father, refused to surrender to silence. He had once been a surveyor, a man who spent decades mapping land no one else had walked, translating chaos into coordinates, turning wild ridgelines into numbers and symbols. But nothing in his experience prepared him for this, a daughter who simply disappeared from the face of a map. While the official search used broad sweeps and probability matrices, Andrew's grief led him down narrower paths. He sold the family's lakeside cabin to fund his search, retired early, bought gear he once would have dismissed as excessive. He returned to the mountains every weekend. His aging Chevy truck became a fixture at obscure trailheads from Rock Creek to Bishop Pass. Rangers began recognizing the outline of his profile behind the wheel long before sunrise. They offered him hot coffee, encouragement, warnings about storms, but none of them tried to stop him, because they understood. He was a man not wandering aimlessly, but working through loss with the only tools he had left: logic, maps, and time. He created his own high-resolution overlays, combining satellite imagery with historical fire maps, recent snowpack data, and even soil composition reports. The Sierra was vast, but he broke it into grids, quadrants, units. Each square represented a day's work. One draw, one ridge, one meadow. He would scan them for the smallest anomalies: a torn scrap of fabric, an unnatural rock pile, the faint depression of disturbed earth. He combed thick brush with gloves and a machete. He dropped a GPS pin every time something didn't sit right. And then he moved to the next square. Always alone, always watching the weather. He no longer believed he would find Rachel alive. That illusion had eroded with the first snowfall. But he believed in bringing her home, and so he kept going. While Andrew searched the physical terrain, a parallel investigation played out across forums and social media. Rachel's disappearance became a touchpoint for the true crime corners of Reddit and hiking forums like Trailwise and SummitNet. Theories emerged. Some stuck to Occam's razor. Rachel had slipped, maybe on wet granite, maybe on one of the infamous snow bridges above the tarns. She had fallen into a crevice or slid beneath downed timber. It was tragic, but plausible. That was the theory law enforcement leaned toward. Others believed in predators, bears, cougars, even wolves that had migrated back into the region. But experts were quick to point out the absence of any signs: no torn gear, no blood, no drag marks near her tent. It didn't fit. Some theorized that Rachel had staged her disappearance, that she had chosen to vanish. They pointed to excerpts from her notebooks, shared publicly by her mother in hopes someone might recognize something. Rachel had written often about solitude, about the weight of connection, about how the wilderness emptied the noise. Lines like those became the basis for the intentional disappearance theory, that Rachel had walked into the mountains to begin a new life, or end the one she had. But it was one detail, vague, frustrating, and yet chilling, that captured most imaginations: the man on the trail. The one Eleanor and Gerald Hale had described. A gaunt face, military pack, didn't return their wave, didn't speak. The forums gave him names: the Sierra Phantom, Ridgewalker, John Doe, South Fork. People assigned him narratives. Some said he was a recluse, a veteran who had never returned home from the war and now wandered the Sierra in solitude. Others suggested he had targeted Rachel from the moment she entered the trailhead. He became the ghost of the story, a shapeless threat that loomed larger than facts. The Rangers had no name, no prints, no sightings since. Just a sketch, just a rumor, and a young woman who had vanished. Months passed. Andrew Quinn still returned each weekend. His maps grew thicker with check marks, red squares that meant searched, nothing found. Online, the forums spiraled further into speculation. A few volunteers from the community came out to help Andrew's strangers who had followed the case and couldn't sit idle anymore. Some brought drones, others brought survival training. Most just brought presence. But nothing changed. Rachel Quinn was still missing, and the Sierra was still silent. But what made his blood truly freeze was what lay beside it: a weathered, dirt-streaked pair of women's underwear, mostly white, but with faded crimson trim lining the elastic waistband and leg openings. David Chen didn't move. For several long seconds he just stared. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the ordinary texture of fabric with the implications it carried. This wasn't trash. This wasn't wind-blown debris or lost gear. This was deliberate, tucked into the heart of a predator's nest. And worse, it matched the exact red Rachel's backpack straps had something that had become seared into the memories of everyone who had studied her case. The nest, 5 feet wide and meticulously woven, had become a dark reliquary, a symbol of something Rachel Quinn had carried or worn in her final journey into these mountains. David backed away slowly, his boots scraping against the ledge's brittle rock. The wind howled up the cliffside as he reached for his service phone. Hands shaking, he snapped multiple photos of the site, each one more damning than the last. Then, with his voice steadying through sheer force of will, he radioed dispatch. "Base, I need a recovery team at my coordinates. I've found possible evidence related to the Quinn case. It's in a golden eagle's nest. Repeat, possible personal belongings confirmed on site." For nearly a year, Rachel Quinn had been a name written in past tense, spoken about as memory, as myth. But now, with that single call, her presence came crashing back into the present. The wilderness had been silent for 11 months, and now it was whispering again. Within 48 hours, a full forensic recovery team was airlifted to the site. Due to the nest's precarious position, a specialized climbing unit had to rappel in from a hovering chopper. Every movement was methodical. Gloves were worn, photographs were taken. Every twig, fiber, and feather catalogued with surgical precision. Along with the piece of turquoise nylon and the underwear, they discovered something else. A few strands of long, light blonde hair tangled in the branches near the edge of the nest. It was enough for a DNA test. Enough to say, she had been here, or at least some part of her had. But how had it gotten there? Golden eagles are powerful birds, capable of lifting animals weighing up to 10 pounds. Had one found her abandoned campsite, or something worse? No one wanted to voice the darker theories out loud, but they hung heavy in the air. Had a scavenger found her first? Had a predator scattered remains in pieces? The questions outnumbered the answers. But one thing was certain. Rachel Quinn had left behind more than just a shadow on the trail. Her parents, Evelyn and John Quinn, were notified in person. The rangers who delivered the news did so with reverent silence, their hats removed, their eyes damp. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was something. Back in Fresno, Rachel's father clutched the printed photo of the eagle's nest as though it were sacred, his daughter's handwriting still tacked to the fridge. Her camera still untouched in her apartment. The pain hadn't softened, but for the first time in months, the silence was breaking. The park reopened a new, narrowed investigation. Rangers revisited the area near the discovery, combing cliff edges, drainage fields, and alpine shelves. Cadaver dogs were deployed again. But the terrain remained merciless. No further remains were found. And yet, something had changed. Locals who once spoke of Rachel in hushed tones now left fresh wildflowers on the trailhead sign where she was last seen. Hikers carried her photo in their packs. The mountains still held their secrets, but they no longer held Rachel in complete silence. She had become a symbol not just of loss, but of the enduring will to be found. And her father? Mark Quinn didn't stop searching. Even after the official efforts were paused again for the winter, he returned, season after season, grid by grid, mountain by mountain. Not because he expected a miracle, but because every daughter deserves a map back home. With trembling hands, David Chen raised his phone and began snapping photographs, each angle, each detail of the nest. He didn't dare touch anything. This was no longer an ornithological observation. This was now a potential crime scene. He steadied his breath, clicked the radio on his shoulder, and said in a voice tighter than usual, "Dispatch, this is Chen. I'm at the nesting site in the upper basin. I may have found something. Something related to the Quinn case." The news hit the ranger station like a lightning bolt. A case that had lain dormant for nearly a year suddenly sparked to life. When David returned with the carefully bagged items, the piece of torn turquoise nylon and the red-trimmed fabric, the investigators reopened the Rachel Quinn file. Inside the sterile lab under fluorescent light, the items were laid on a white cloth beside a high-resolution image of Rachel's last known photo. The match was unmistakable. The faded red trim of the garment matched the distinctive accent straps of Rachel's backpack, the same pack seen in that final image at the trailhead. A grave silence settled over the room. It was no longer just a missing persons case. A new, darker theory began to form, one built not from conjecture, but from the hard, unflinching laws of nature. Golden eagles, majestic as they are also opportunistic. Scavengers, as much as predators, they're drawn to decay to the scent of blood. What if, investigators whispered, a golden eagle had located Rachel's remains? What if it had found her clothing, or even her body, and scavenged a piece of it, carrying the fabric to reinforce its nest, as birds have done for millennia? That theory changed everything. This wasn't a vague trace carried miles downstream by water. This wasn't a sighting lost in the folds of unconfirmed rumors. This was physical evidence tied directly to the last known image of Rachel Quinn. And more importantly, it narrowed the map. If the eagle had scavenged from her remains, they had to be nearby. Raptors don't carry their materials across vast distances. The nest, then, was a breadcrumb, and the wilderness had, finally, given up its first clue. The Park Service quickly authorized a new, highly targeted search, not across hundreds of miles, but focused to just one quadrant, a steep, treacherous hillside beneath the nesting site. This was no longer a rescue operation. It was a recovery. A new team assembled, a grim coalition of expertise. Forensic anthropologists from UC Davis, cadaver dogs, trained in wilderness detection, veteran SAR personnel from Placer County, who specialized in high-angle recovery. By first light, they were flown by helicopter into the remote basin beneath the eagle's perch. The helicopter stirred the alpine grasses as it landed, whipping the air into a frenzy. But the moment boots hit the earth, the tone shifted. Here, under the shadow of ancient granite cliffs, was a place of breathtaking beauty now forever altered by the gravity of what they sought. The search grid, though small just under a square mile, was some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Sierra Nevada. Scree that slid underfoot like ball bearings. Wind-warped pines clinging to sheer rock faces. Dense brush growing between boulders the size of pickup trucks. Each step had to be deliberate, each breath measured. The dog teams moved in slow, methodical sweeps. Odin, a black Labrador known for his tenacity, took the lead. On the third morning, just as morale began to fray under the weight of silence and exhaustion, Odin stopped. He stood near a thick tangle of mountain laurel and snarled ferns, beside a crescent-shaped cluster of glacial stones. Then came the whine, low, insistent. His paw scratched at the earth. The handler raised a hand. "Final alert," she said. The team rushed in. Dr. Alana Rios, the forensic anthropologist, crouched beside the dog. To anyone else the spot looked unremarkable, just another patch of wilderness. But to her trained eyes it told a different story. The earth had sunk, just slightly. Rocks that should have rolled with erosion were still, unnaturally placed. She pointed. "Start here." They began digging with trowels and brushes. No shovels, no rushing. The ground was sacred now. After an hour, one of the searchers stopped. His tool had scraped something, not rock, not soil, but fabric. He leaned in, brushing the earth away with gloved fingers. A strip of faded blue nylon emerged the sleeve of a technical shirt. A few inches away, another find. Bone. Human. The digging grew more deliberate. A body, or what remained of one, began to take shape. A shallow grave, no deeper than 2 feet. There were no signs of violence, no weapons, no drag marks. Just a body, hidden in the folds of the earth, guarded by silence and time. The remains were airlifted to Sacramento for formal identification. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their bones. Rachel Quinn had been found. After 353 days in the wilderness, her name would no longer appear in the missing persons database. For her father, Michael Quinn, the call came just after sunset. He had never stopped searching, never accepted the word gone as final. That night, he sat in his truck at the base of Donner Pass, the map of Rachel's original route still pinned to his dashboard. His eyes blurred, his jaw clenched. He whispered the only words that mattered. "You're coming home." The remains belonged to Rachel Quinn. When the news reached her parents, it landed with the force of both an earthquake and a benediction. A devastating finality, yes, but also the end of limbo. After a year of silence, a whisper of closure crept into the crushing grief. Their daughter, who had walked into the Sierra Nevada wilderness and vanished, had finally been found. But any sense of peace shattered when the autopsy report was completed. Dr. Alana Rios's forensic examination of the skeletal remains revealed something far more horrifying than the simple tragedy of a hiking misstep. There were multiple fractures, yes, but not consistent with a fall. One in particular stood out, a massive cranial fracture that could only have been caused by a blunt force blow. The location, shape, and severity of the damage told a different story. Rachel had been attacked. And that wasn't all. Trace evidence recovered with the body confirmed something even darker. Rachel Quinn had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered. The case, dormant for nearly a year, was now officially reclassified. This was no longer the tragic story of a young photographer lost to the wild. It was a homicide. A brutal, premeditated act of violence hidden beneath the veneer of wilderness silence. The new classification sent tremors through every level of the investigation. Detectives went back to the beginning, combing through the earliest reports and witness statements. Every detail now took on a sinister weight. The vague recollection of a man spotted on the trail, the one described as intense, with a military-style backpack and vacant eyes, was no longer just a curious footnote. He was now a suspect. The composite sketch, once circulated in the hope he might have simply seen something, was now reissued to the press, and public this time with the urgent caption, "Person of Interest in Homicide." The image spread fast, especially among online true crime forums that had followed Rachel's case obsessively for months. The once abstract mystery had taken a sharp, horrifying turn into reality. The break came unexpectedly. Brenda Malone, a night manager at a budget motel in Mariposa, Californian hours southwest of Yosemite, saw the sketch on the local evening news. She froze. She'd seen that face. A man had stayed at her motel the previous summer. Quiet. Paid in cash. Never gave a surname. Registered simply as Bob. She remembered him because he gave her the creeps. He'd never smiled. Never made small talk. He checked out abruptly one afternoon, just days after flyers about a missing hiker had gone up around town. She called the Sierra County Sheriff's tip line. That call changed everything. Using the motel's logbooks and local labor agency records, investigators confirmed the name Robert Bob Frazier, a 42-year-old transient who moved seasonally between construction jobs, working under the table for cash. His digital footprint was nearly non-existent, but he had a sealed juvenile record out of Oregon that included an aggravated assault charge. With his identity confirmed, a multi-agency task force traced Frazier to a remote ranch outside Redding, where he had taken a temporary job as a groundskeeper. At dawn, federal and county agents raided the property. Frazier was arrested without resistance. His expression didn't change. Cold. Detached. Inside a storage shed tucked behind a horse barn, agents found a locked metal footlocker. It was old, dented, military surplus. Inside, they found what amounted to a predator's collection: a necklace, a few hair clips, 3 women's driver's licenses, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded green T-shirt, a Nikon D750 camera. The serial number matched Rachel Quinn's. At the FBI's Sacramento Forensics Lab, techs recovered the memory card. What they found was damning. The first set of photos were Rachel's the same landscapes her parents had loved. Sweeping valleys, wildflowers in bloom. Then abruptly the tone shifted. The next sequence had been taken by Frazier. The images were clinical, cold, documenting the horror he had inflicted. Rachel's final moments, her struggle, and her death were all there, frozen in digital clarity. There was no denying it. This was the work of a killer. In the sterile, windowless interview room at the county jail, Frazier sat in silence for hours. 2 investigators, a veteran FBI profiler and a detective from the Sierra County Sheriff's Office, took turns questioning him. He didn't speak. His silence was not born of fear. It was deliberate, strategic. He believed that without a confession there could be no conviction. But the agents didn't need his words. The FBI agent brought in a manila folder. Saturday down. Opened it. He didn't say anything. One by one, he laid out the photographs. The first few were Rachel's. Sunrise over granite cliffs, a distant eagle circling a canyon. Then came the shift. A blurry image of Rachel from a distance. Then closer. Her expression. Her terror. The assault. Frazier stared. Blinked. For the first time, his mask cracked. The detective leaned forward and said, "We don't need your confession. The mountains told us everything." And Frazier was charged with the murder and sexual assault of Rachel Quinn within 48 hours. The case shocked California and reverberated across the nation. News outlets aired segments. Documentaries began production. Rachel's parents, who had spent a year suspended between hope and despair, finally had answers. But those answers carried no peace. There was no grave, only ashes. Her remains were cremated, her ashes scattered at the edge of the very trailhead she had set off from where a photo of her still hangs, smiling beneath the towering pines. The wilderness that had once given her so much inspiration became her final witness. And the eagle, unknowingly, became her voice. Rachel was hiking, unaware she was being watched. The first photo showed her from a distance, just a small figure among towering pines. The next image was closer. Then another. The investigators laid them out on the metal table like a storyboard, a silent and damning narrative of her final hours. Finally came the images of the assault. Clinical, brutal, undeniable. No captions were needed. The sequence spoke with a voice louder than anything that could be said aloud. As each image was placed before him, Robert Ellis Frazier no longer a mystery, no longer a phantom watched silently. His denials ceased. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The hum of the ceiling bent the only sound as the final images rested before him. According to the transcript, Frazier sat in silence for 7 full minutes. His eyes were fixed on the grim timeline laid bare before him, a visual indictment no words could unravel. Then, finally, he spoke. "That's me," he said, his voice flat. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply nodded toward one of the photographs as if acknowledging a receipt, a fact. And just like that, the dam broke. What followed was not remorse. It wasn't even explanation. It was narration cold, factual, and horrifying. He described seeing Rachel at the trailhead near Crystal Basin. Something about her had drawn his attention, he said, her smile, her solitude. He followed her from a distance, watching as she set up camp by Lost Lake, waiting for the moment she would be alone. He recounted how he waited until she wandered from her tent to refill her water bottle. He moved quickly, silently. When asked why he did it, why he killed her, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. "She fought harder than I expected," he said. "I had to." He buried her beneath a cluster of boulders at the foot of a talus slope, hidden beneath the ancient silence of the forest. Then he took her camera Nikon she had saved up for during college and walked out of the wilderness as if nothing had happened. When pressed again for a deeper reason, he stared at the detectives and said, "She shouldn't have been out there alone." Frazier's confession didn't end with Rachel. Over the next 2 hours, he spoke of other Womento hikers whose disappearances had haunted different corners of the American West. A 28-year-old environmental science teacher in Colorado. A recent college graduate in Idaho. In each case, the pattern was the same. Solitude, silence, opportunity. The ghost now had a name. The trial of Robert Ellis Frazier was swift but harrowing. Armed with the photographic evidence from Rachel's camera and Frazier's detailed confession, the prosecution presented a case that left no room for doubt. The courtroom in Plumas County was packed. Reporters, local residents, and families of other victims filled every seat. Rachel's parents, Benjamin and Karen Quinn, sat silently in the front row. Day after day they listened as clinical testimony peeled back the final hours of their daughter's life. They never wept in public. Their pain was too deep, too private for tears. Frazier sat stone-faced throughout. No remorse, no outburst. Just that same empty expression. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault, and kidnapping. The judge delivered the sentence in a voice heavy with emotion. life without the possibility of parole. Frazier would be behind bars. But the impact of the case didn't end there. Inside Frazier's locked footlocker, investigators had found more than just Rachel's camera. There were other trophies: IDs, jewelry, small personal items, keepsakes from women who had vanished into the wilderness without a trace. One belonged to Elena Carver, who disappeared in 2020 while backpacking solo in Colorado's Uncompahgre Range. Another belonged to Lily Cho, a 22-year-old student last seen near Redfish Lake, Idaho. With Frazier's confession, their bodies were finally recovered. The families, who had endured years of unbearable uncertainty, were given the bittersweet gift of closure. Frazier's legacy would forever stain the trail networks of the Sierra Nevada and the surrounding wilderness. He was not just a killer. He was a predator who used the solitude and serenity of the backcountry as cover for monstrous acts. A man who walked through national parks like a shadow, hiding in plain sight, leaving only pain behind. For Benjamin and Karen Quinn, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. They buried Rachel on a hillside above Crystal Basin, near the place she had loved most. The memorial service was held not in a church, but under the open sky, with the granite ridges of the Sierra watching silently above. Her hiking boots and camera strap were placed on the altar. Friends and family spoke through tears, remembering her love of wild places, her eye for light, her laughter. When Benjamin Quinn stood to speak, the crowd went still. He was a man transformed by grief thinner, grayer, but his voice was steady. "We came here today because Rachel loved this place," he said, "and because this place loved her back, even in silence, even in darkness." He thanked the search teams. He thanked the ranger who'd found the nest. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "I just wanted to find my daughter." The crowd stood in silence. A few wept. A few looked to the sky. And, high above, riding the thermals, a golden eagle soared. Rachel's story left an indelible scar on the community of Tahoe and across the network of hikers and wanderers who once found peace in the wild. It became a cautionary tale, not just about the cruelty of a single man, but about the illusion of safety we carry into nature. The wilderness remained unchanged. The sun still rose over the peaks. The streams still sang beneath the cedars. But for those who had heard Rachel's story, who had seen her face smiling back from the posters, the forest now carried a quieter, darker undertone. Because sometimes the storm isn't in the sky. Sometimes the predator walks on two legs,